Hello, everyone. Here we are, our DBQ, practice DBQ for time period number 5. This DBQ starts with a statement: the Civil War was not inevitable. It was the result of extremism and failures of leadership on both sides. And it asks you to assess the validity of this statement using the following documentation and your knowledge of the period from 1840 to 1861. Um, there's not like one right thesis. Remember, we talked about the coming of the Civil War as being that each side had the growing perception that the other one was trying to force its ideology on them, and that it was becoming less and less willing to compromise. So, for example, the North you see more people believing in the slave power conspiracy, the disproportionate political influence that the southern states had over the federal government, which was being used to perpetuate slavery at the expense of free labor and free soil, and that slavery was not on its course to extinction, was not going to be contained where it was, but that the South would manipulate the federal government to continue its limitless expansion. Most people aren't for racial equality and for abolition because it's wrong. It's more so out of an idea of self-interest, because, like, again, the idea, like, every American is going to say that it flies in the face of liberty and that it's wrong on a moral level. We're talking about what dominates more rank and file people is the idea that opportunities for freedmen and free labor are lessened in a society that allows slave labor. Okay. Craft your thesis somewhere around there. Context. So what happens before 1840? Well, you'd probably say there was compromises reached over the issue of slavery at the Constitutional Convention, where in the interest of getting a national government, there are 3 concessions made to slavery in the Constitution: 3/5 for representation, fugitive slave clause, and the no restricting the importation of slaves for 20 years. And it probably set the context that in the era of good feelings, we have our first national political debate over the issue of slavery with the Missouri crisis of 1819, and there is a temporary respite in 1820 with the 3630 line, Missouri and Maine. The balance is maintained. During this time, America expands, and now you're talking 1840. I'm bringing in my outside evidence right here. Now I'm just going to hit you and be like, okay, there is so much outside evidence in here. It's impossible to just try to think of 2 things, right? But you would say, as there's manifest destiny, there is a perception. Well, wait a second, is this for an empire for liberty or an empire for slavery? The whole notion of the leaked letter from John C. Calhoun in 1844, which then turned the Senate against the annexation of Texas, and the Mexican War and the opposition to the expansion of slavery in it with the Wilmot Proviso. And we've reviewed that a million times about how that passes twice in the House, but it is denied in the Senate. And how Southerners get very much on the defense that the federal government once again is trying to restrict slavery. Northerners see, again, the South disproportionate political influence by its de facto veto in the Senate. And it was that grabbing of all this new territory that's not covered by the Missouri Compromise that opens up a new debate on slavery, particularly with the application of California for statehood. So as you look at document number 1, there you go. Right? Bully for you, man. If right away you recognize, you're like, Daniel Webster, speech of March 7th. I know that. That's in defense of the Compromise of 1850. So definitely with this document, you want to put it in the context of the Compromise for 1850. Who's Daniel Webster? He's an old senator. He's part of this old group that's desperately trying to hang on and work out a compromise, him and Clay. And as he's speaking here, in the context of trying to get this compromise passed, right? You know all the 5 parts. This is the California is a free state. Tough New Fugitive Slave Act. Texas cedes its New Mexican territory in exchange for $10 million. no slavery, no slave trade in Washington, D.C., but slavery is guaranteed there, right? But here you see, in the context of trying to defend compromise, who's he attacking? He's attacking abolitionists, right? And remember that abolitionists are not the majority. They're a noisy little group inspired by the evangelical movement of the Second Great Awakening. Slavery is a sin. I'm bringing a million things here. William Lloyd Garrison and Morris Suasion, the American Anti-Slavery Society. And remember, the Senate voted for the gag rule, and Congress did not even hear these petitions. And so here you see like a really moderate, old time now, because remember, he dies during the Compromise of 1850, who's speaking for compromise. Like, if you could demonstrate that in this document, you would knock it out of the park. And he is criticizing the abolitionists as being too radical. As we look at Uncle Tom's Cabin, we talked about in our review how this shapes perceptions. A whole generation of Northerners see slavery as this inhumane, barbaric institution because all the worst attributes of slavery are highlighted in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Go back and look at the review again. Break of the family, sexual exploitation, the slave market, the horrific physical brutality that is present. And this is, and remember, Southerners are so upset because not only do they feel that Northerners are becoming hostile towards slavery by all of this false propaganda, but like Tom's the hero, right? And here is a black man, a slave, that has his morality elevated and is on the same moral level as a white person. And as you read this document here, this is where, the evil Simon Legree is beating Tom to death. And you can use this, and I already went over it, sorry, in terms of how this, again, puts Southerners on the defensive because they view this as the perspective of all of Northern society. And Northern society is starting to see more and more the perception that paternalism is a myth, as more and more people are becoming morally opposed to slavery. Abraham Lincoln here. We have a Lincoln and a Douglas one, both from 1858, right? And as Lincoln is speaking, this is where he gives his House Divided speech, right? And this is while, what's happening, context, right? They're running for Senate. We reviewed a ton of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I'm not going to go back and rehash all of that again, but he's running for Senate against Stephen Douglas. As we look at document 4 and Stephen Douglas, we have context. This is the guy that undid the Missouri Compromise through the Kansas-Nebraska Act to suit his own political ends of getting a railroad to Chicago. This is a guy that pushed the Compromise of 1850. And here's Lincoln in the whole context of this debate. You've got Lincoln, who always tried to present like the moderate face of republicanism. And then he just came right out and said, I'm not for civil rights. I'm for natural rights, the right of the Declaration of Independence, a right for a man to eat his own bread, but not for civil rights, not for full racial equality, making jurors, making voters of freedmen, et cetera, et cetera. But in these two together, remember what Douglas does during these debates is try to play Lincoln as a black Republican, and he's an abolitionist. And even though Lincoln always says, right, that look, I will never end slavery where it already exists. I don't like it. I wish it would go away. It makes me miserable. He criticizes it on moral grounds, but he does not, he's got that free soil position of stopping the expansion of slavery. But this statement, it can be interpreted as, the Union's not going to last half slave and half free. And if you're a Southern fire eater, you see this as, oh, here's a guy who's talking about for the Union to survive, slavery has to end. Because there's no way, that we're going to buy that he is going to see the whole thing become slave. When we talk about Alton, Illinois, which is in Southern Illinois, remember that's where Reverend Elijah Lovejoy was murdered after his printing press had been burned down for the 5th time, as he was an abolitionist back in the 1830s. And it was in that southern part of Illinois that Douglas really puts out that argument in the context, again, of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's a national debate over slavery, right? the one thing is these documents are so easy to provide, description of, context for, right, in that explained category. And so here's Douglas, what's at the heart of this? Douglas doesn't take a moral position on slavery, and that's what Lincoln tries to keep hammering him on. That, and of course, at the Freeport Doctrine, where he said, how can you reconcile the idea of you champion popular sovereignty, Doug, but at the same time, here another piece of outside evidence, the Dred Scott decision. It said that slavery can't be banned in a territory. So certainly great outside pieces of evidence. Used reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That would be phenomenal, as that's really the death of the Whig Party. You could bring in the Dred Scott decision, as we talked about. What's beer next? That the next Supreme Court case is going to say that any northern state doesn't have the right to ban slavery. You could bring in the Fugitive Slave Act, right? And we talked about that. And Anthony Burns, that's another great piece of outside evidence. I mean, you literally have a mountain of outside evidence that you could pick here. And so here we have Douglas that's, again, his problem is not with slavery. It's the debate over slavery. Who does he want it left up to here? The states. And that's the argument that he's making, that this has always been a state issue, right? It's the old, we're going to punt it federally. Here, Frederick Douglass is talking about John Brown 20 years after the fact, more than 20 years, almost 25 years after the fact. And remember, like, really very few people, even Douglass, doesn't think that this is the way to go about ending slavery. But if we remember Stephen Douglas in John Brown from the Civil War, right? I can still hear Morgan Freeman say, his zeal in the cause was far greater than mine. While I was willing to live for the slave, John Brown was willing to die. And in retrospect, he's talking about the importance of what John Brown did. And this was one of our Blue Book questions, right? What did Herman Melville call them? The meteor, right? That here is the worst possible scenario for Southerners, which is a slave insurrection. So here's an abolitionist with a track record, right? Pottawatomie Creek, broadsword, boom, bullet in the head. Killed a man during the Missouri raid to free slaves and taking them to Canada. And while John Brown is not praised by any politician, in fact, he's condemned by Lincoln, there's a Southern perception that, oh my, this is something that the Northern people admire. They don't want to see slavery, and they want to see slavery and the slaves rise up and kill us. And so we talked about the total intransigence of the South after that, the linking of every Northerner who was hostile to slavery to being a radical abolitionist, and radical abolitionists were now linked to the violence of John Brown trying to start a slave revolt in Virginia. We talked about the South mobilizing militarily, and the what was it? Ed Beers, who said, the Confederate militia system, which had been a joke before John Brown, now starts to really organize. And then finally, we tried to really drive this home by looking at Mississippi and South Carolina's Declaration of Secessions, and that how they were seceding because they felt the federal government had become hostile to slavery, plain and simple. And certainly you see that here, and you definitely want to put it in the context of, what is the event that precedes this? It's all these events, and then it's Lincoln's election. Back to the idea that any Republican is a black Republican, any Republican is really an abolitionist, and every abolitionist is really a closet John Brown. And you see these states secede. That's I think a real easy piece to work with. And again, outside piece of evidence. We learned. Go back in your notes. We've got your reading packet. We've got Mississippi's Declaration of Secession. Look, this is a really tough one to work with, and I would say don't get in the weeds, man. Don't try to break all of this down. Look at the big picture. See the forest through the trees. What's the forest through the trees? Oh, we're starting to see a significant growth of Republicans in both the House and in the Senate, right? And remember, if you're a Republican, there's a lot of Whig stuff in there, like internal improvements, high protective tariff, money for squatters, the Homestead Act, right? But ultimately, it's no more slave states, no more slave territories. And you can see how they grow. Remember, Kansas-Nebraska Act is the death of the Whig Party, right? And, I guess if I'm doing this, I'm really breaking it down. I'm going Eric Foner on you and talking about, what kept the country together was that you had national parties. The Republican Party, how many votes did they get in the South? None. None, right? As a candidate is elected who gets no votes in any of the states of the future Confederacy. So I would use this document more in the context of showing how the rise of Republicans and the perception of what Republicans stand for, even though it's not accurate, is what scares the South. And put again, what causes this rise of Republicans is all of these things that go for the South, whether it be the Kansas Nebraska Act, whether it be Dred Scott, um, whether it be bleeding Kansas where all the border ruffians come in and set up a fake Lecompton Constitution, and then you've got a dough-faced president like Buchanan that supports the Lecompton Constitution, or a dough-faced president like Pierce who signs off on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is the most slam dunk of slam dunk conclusions I've ever seen. The Civil War. That's what resolves this. And talking about the impact of how horrific the Civil War, 2% of the population dies. And, then the slave, and that's what ends the issue of slavery, but by no means settles the citizenship of future freed men. So there you go, our practice DBQ. Once again, by all means, if you had done this, please email me the template and I will provide you with feedback. Hopefully that helped you out.